So how you doing?
Okay.
That's a very investigative first question.
Yeah.
I just want to get right to
the point.
Right.
Dig right hard. Yeah.
Well, the American people have spoken once again in the 96 elections, and Clinton says it's a vindication of the vital center, which he locates somewhere between overheated liberalism and Chile conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reading on the 96 elections?
Was there any choice other than the vital center? As far as I know, Clinton and Dole were moderate Republicans, more or less interchangeable, representatives of the business community, old-time government insiders. Maybe there were personality differences. They have somewhat different constituencies, so they may behave slightly differently. No, I think the election was not a vote for the vital center. It was just a vote against. Both candidates were unpopular. Very few people expected anything from either of them. Voting, as you know, was at a historic low. I think it just reflected the general sense that the political system isn't functioning.
A great political thinker, Lewis Carroll, wrote a book called Through the Looking Glass, and there was a couple of characters in there, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and they seemed on the surface to be quite different, but in fact there was nothing between the two. And Ralph Nader has been talking about the Republicans and the Democrats as Tweedledum, Tweedledee.
It's usually the case. I mean, there's never much of a difference between the parties. After all, they are two business parties. But over the years, it's probably been narrowing. In my view, the last liberal president was Richard Nixon. After that, it's been straight, what they call here, conservative, starting with Carter running through to the present. And that, I think, is a reflection of things happening in the economy and social life. It's a reflection of more general things. The kind of gesture to liberalism that was required from the New Deal through, say, Nixon became less necessary with new weapons of class war developing in the early 70s. And proceeding on to what the business press, in one of my favorite phrases, calls capital's subjugation of labor for 15 years, actually, I'd say 20 years. Under those circumstances, you can drop the window dressing. That's the standard story about welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism is kind of introduced in order to undercut democracy. You see this if you look closely. I mean, if people are trying to take over some aspect of their lives, and it doesn't seem any way to stop them, one standard response is to say, okay, I'll do it for you. Hold on. I'll close.
Okay.
I mean, one standard historical pattern is when the society begins to get a bit democratized, so people try to take over some aspect of their affairs and run it. If it can't be stopped, the next normal reaction is to say, okay, don't worry about it, I'll do it for you. Me, us rich guys. So, for example, a classic example, which is an important one, was in Flint, Michigan, early in this century. Flint's an important town. It was the center of General Motors, so like the heart of the automobile revolution, around 1910 or so. There was a good deal of popular, in fact, socialist and labor organizing, and there were plans to really take things over, run them themselves, support unions, have public services done democratically. Flint was a GM town at that time, and the wealthy business community was very upset by that, naturally. It meant that it was no longer going to be a company town. And they, after a bit of up and back, finally decided to come along with a progressive line. Say, yeah, everything you're doing is right. We'll run a candidate who will support, and he'll do all those things, and we can do it a lot better because we have all these resources. So we'll take it over. You want a park? Fine. Vote for the business candidate. He'll put in a park. Look at the resources we have and the business acumen and so on. And that won. It destroyed the The array of resources was such that that undermined and eliminated the incipient democratic structures and popular structures, and indeed there was welfare capitalism until such time as they didn't need it anymore. When they didn't need that weapon, then it was dropped. It's like benevolent autocracy. I mean, sometimes you get a benevolent autocrat, but it's the autocracy that's illegitimate. And it's illegitimate in itself, and besides, the autocrat can always stop being benevolent when he feels like. That's welfare capitalism. Well, there was a kind of a contract. During the Depression, there was a lot of popular struggle. Rights were won. They extended, there was a live union movement. There were other pressures. After the Second World War, a big attack started on this right away, but it took time. And it was getting somewhere in the 50s, but then in the 60s there was a lot more ferment, so you get new programs and, war on poverty, I mean, things coming out of the civil rights movement and so on. By the early 70s, the business attack was reaching new heights, had new weapons. You can forget the social contract, forget the welfare capitalism. Since we've been running it, we're going to throw it out. And that's pretty much what's been going on since. The population knows it. The population recognizes that the political parties don't represent them. And by now it's reached enormous disaffection. There are interesting things about the disaffection. It's mostly directed against government. Only indirectly we don't really know if it's directed against business, because that's not the kind of question that's asked in polls. I remember the business propaganda, which is just about everything in public, is designed to direct your attention to the government, not to business. The typical picture in business propaganda since the Second World War has been, there's all of us together, we live in harmony, Joe Sixpack, his loyal wife, the hardworking executive, the friendly banker, we're all one big happy family. And then there's those bad guys out there who are trying to disrupt our harmony, like union organizers and big government and so on. But we're all going to try to get together and defend ourselves against them. And in fact, that's the picture presented everywhere, from television comedies to to books and scholarship, and it's understandable. I mean, you want to pretend that there's class harmony between the person with the hammer and the person who is beating over the head, and that outside factor is dangerous, and it is dangerous because it's potentially democratic. It offers a way for the public to enter into organizing affairs, so we better keep it down. Actually, the attitude is ambivalent. The popular aspects of government, the kinds of government that allow participation, they have to be beaten down. But the so-called conservatives want a very powerful state, only one that works for them and is removed from public control. So there's a kind of a tricky position you have to take. You're in the Heritage Foundation today. You have to talk about minimizing the state but increasing the Pentagon. Because the Pentagon is the funnel for subsidy of high-tech industry. So that's a tricky line to follow, but as long as there isn't much in the way of public debate, you can sort of get away with it. And that's the picture. So people, they hate the government. What they feel about business power is unclear.
There is a recent poll which showed that 71% of Americans feel that big business corporations
have too much
influence in the political system.
Yeah, and if you look at those polls, they're interesting. Some of them are outlandish. I mean, by 20-1, virtually 95% of people think that, here's the wording, corporations should sometimes sacrifice some profit for workers and community. The sums that was the way the question was asked. So I don't know what the answer would have been. Corporations should sacrifice profit for business and community. My guess, it still would have been 95%. But notice that and that shows, overwhelming feeling. You never get numbers like that in polls, that something's really seriously wrong. And there are many such indications. On the other hand, notice that that's still a call for welfare capitalism. It falls way short of what working people were asking for, say, 150 years ago, right here in Boston. I read up some of this stuff in Z last couple of months ago. At that time, the question there wasn't be more benevolent, give us a little bit of your profits. It was, you have no right to rule. We should own the factories. Now, the move from a benevolent autocrat is always going to try to make it appear as if autocracy is necessary. The only choice is, will I be a harsh autocrat or will I be a benevolent autocrat? You can't get rid of the king. That's the law of nature. So if you want, I'll be a nice king if you're nice, or else I'll be a harsh king. Those are the choices you have. And it's the propaganda system obviously wants to have the same attitude with regard to the contemporary autocrats. So business can be a little nicer, and maybe you don't have quite as much corporate welfare, but you have more welfare capitalism. But the autocratic structure must remain, that you're not allowed to challenge, as distinct from the past, where of course it was challenged, and rightly.
A couple of the startling statistics from the November 96 elections, at least for me, was the voter turnout, 49%, the lowest since 1924. At the same time...
It's actually the lowest ever.
Lowest ever?
Well, 24 is misleading because 1924 was the first year in which women were allowed to vote. So the participation, a smaller percentage of the electorate voted because a lot of women didn't vote the first time around. But if you take a realistic picture, this is the lowest percentage ever.
And the other figure is that more money than ever before was spent on the campaign, 1.6 billion that we know about. So more money is spent and fewer people are voting.
That makes sense. It's becoming, as one of the television commentators pointed out, it's not, these weren't conventions, they were coronations. That's correct. It's another step towards eliminating whatever functioning elements there are in formal democracy, and that's part of the general business assault against freedom, against markets, contrary to what a lot of people say, against democracy, which is exactly natural. What else would one expect in a period of capital subjugation of labor?
Another commentator has called elections equivalent to auctions. They go into the highest bidder.
Yeah, we shouldn't suggest that it was ever all that different, but yes, it's narrowing, and it's narrowing as part of these general tendencies. On the other hand, if the public responds, like, for example, if you find union organizing building up and grassroots organizations develop and people are pressuring and so on, it'll change. And the first change will be, okay, we'll be more benevolent autocrats. We'll have a little welfare capitalism. And if it goes on beyond that, you can get significant social change.
There's some clamor now for something that's called campaign finance reform. What's your take on that?
It's not a bad thing, but it's not going to have very much effect. There are too many ways to cheat. It's like trying to pretend to stop drugs. There's so many ways to do it that it'll always happen. I don't think the real problem is campaign financing. I mean, the real problem is the overwhelming power of corporate tyrannies in the running of the society. And campaign financing reform is not going to change that.
The social policy continues apace. In August of '96, the president signed something called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which eliminated the 61-year-old federal government commitment to the poor. And I know you've commented it has always been very limited and has declined sharply since
around 1970, since the assault began, yeah.
But you got to like the wording of that.
The wording's fine. It says 7-year-old children have to have personal responsibility, and now they have an opportunity which was deprived them before, like namely the opportunity to starve. Yeah, that's it's very Orwellian, but I'm so transparent that I doubt if many people are fooled. And it's just another assault against the people we don't, against defenseless people. It's now felt, well, okay, we can kick them in the face. And of course, this too is based on a very effective propaganda campaign to make much of the population hate and fear the poor. That's smart. You don't want to get them to look at the rich guys. Don't let them take a look at the pages of Fortune and Business Week talking about the dazzling, stupendous profit growth. Don't let them look at the way the military system is pouring funds into advanced technology. No, not supposed to look at that. What you're supposed to look at is the black mother driving a Cadillac and picking up her welfare check so she can have more babies. And why should I pay for that? No. And that's been done very effectively. So yeah, people, it's striking again when you look at attitudes. Most people think the government has a responsibility to ensure reasonable standards, minimal standards for poor people. On the other hand, most people are against welfare, which does exactly that. That's a propaganda achievement, which you have to admire.
There's also a rather...
And so there's another aspect of this which is being much less discussed, but it's quite crucial. One of the purposes of driving people into work away from welfare is to lower wages. Remember, there's supposed to be a natural unemployment rate. You're not allowed to get below that unemployment rate or all sorts of terrible things happen. Well, we can talk about that. But assuming that's true, you ought to be paying these people to be on welfare. They're keeping the unemployment rate high enough. Suppose you put them into the labor market. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to have to, presumably they're going to take jobs. If they get jobs, that's going to lower unemployment. Terrible thing. If they do get jobs, if they don't get jobs, they're going to drive down the wages. In fact, even if they do get jobs, they'll drive down wages because it's already happening. Like in New York, city services are now using partially subsidized workfare, which simply eliminates union labor. Yeah, that's a good way of making everybody suffer. So put a lot of unskilled, hopeless labor into the public, into the workplace. Make conditions so awful that people take virtually anything. Maybe have some public subsidy to keep them doing it. Yeah, you can drive wages down that way.
What's going on with the attacks on, well, I won't say attacks, but a campaign to undermine public confidence in Social Security? There's no money there, it's going broke. When the baby boomers reach that age, when they're retiring, there'll be no money for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, most of the talk about Social Security is pretty fraudulent. Like, say, take the question about privatizing it. I mean, that's a non-issue. If people believe that it would be better for Social Security to be invested in the stock market rather than in, say, treasury bonds, that can be done whether it's public or private. There's nothing to do with public or private. I think the main goal is really to privatize it. That is, to make people in charge of their individual assets and not to have the solidarity that comes from doing something together. So extremely important is to break down the sense that I have any responsibility for the next guy. You're supposed to have responsibility only for yourself. It's supposed to be a society based on, the ideal is a society based on a social unit which consists of you and your television set, and nothing to do with any other people. So if the kid next door is hungry, it's not your problem, it's his problem. If a person next door has invested his assets badly and is now starving in his old age, well, tough, they learn responsibility. Social Security was something that brought people together. It said, okay, we're going to have a common responsibility to ensure that all of us have a minimal standard of living. That's all of us. It's a communal action, under this case, done through the state. And that's dangerous because it says that it implies that people can work together. And that puts bad ideas into people's head. If you can work together, well, you can do lots of things. For example, you can replace corporate tyranny by worker control if you can work together. You can get involved in the democratic process and make your own decisions if you can work together. Much better to create a mentality in which each person has control over their own assets, they behave individually, and then what happens depends on what happens. The powerful will win, the poor will get smashed. But there won't be any solidarity or communication or mutual support or information sharing or any of these things that might lead to democracy and justice. That's a very important move, and I think that's what lies behind the Social Security propaganda. The other issues are technical and of whatever significance they are, but probably not much. So a slightly more progressive taxation could keep Social Security functioning the way it is functioning for an indefinite future.
So in a sense, we're moving from an injury to one as an injury to all to an injury to one as an injury to one.
You're supposed to, which is the ideal of a capitalist society, except for one thing. Remember, it's, as usual, double-edged. So it doesn't work for the rich. Take, say, a business. What's a business? Well, a business isn't a business is a tyrannical system run by a very visible hand, maybe a bunch of visible hands, controlled from top down and extricated from the market. Internally, there aren't market relations, so it has internally it has its command economy. May be partially inserted into a market if it's a huge corporation, not very much, but it's within that tyrannical system. People can benefit a great deal. The point is to make sure that others don't have those benefits. There you can work together, like the board of directors can work together. The banks and investors can work together. Sure, that's fine. They're allowed to. It's just poor individuals are not allowed to.
The nature of the economic system is perhaps revealed by Duane Andreas, the CEO of Archer Daniels Midland, the Decatur, Illinois-based grain giant. This is what Andreas says. He says there isn't one grain of anything in the world, not one. The only place the only place you see a free market is in the speeches of politicians. It's a rather revelatory comment. Usually the managers are careful about what they say.
Who was he talking to?
This was quoted in Mother Jones and Multinational.
Who was he talking to, though?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I suspect he was talking to a business group. Yeah, I imagine. That's not the kind of thing that you tell the public. But, of course, it's true. I'm going to take what's called trade. It's the most dramatic example. About 50% of U.S. trade actually is internal to a single corporation. So, for example, if Ford Motor Company ships a part from Indiana to Illinois, that's not called trade. If it shifts it from Illinois to northern Mexico, it is called trade. It's called an export when it goes and an import when it comes back. But in fact, all of this is centrally managed in ways which undercut markets, designed for the obvious purpose of exploiting cheaper labor and avoiding environmental regulations and playing games with where you pay your taxes and so on. That's about 50% of U.S. trade. Japan is about the same. I think England's even higher. When people talk about the growth in world trade, what they're talking about is largely a joke. What's growing is complicated interactions among centrally managed institutions, which are of the scale of command economies. Within them, there's no free trade, and among them, there's various oligopolistic relationships. But yes, but I disagree with this guy when he says there's no free trade. There is free trade for 7-year-old kids, and for poor people in the third world. Yeah, for them, free trade. They have to meet responsibility, not the rich guys. There was an interesting study recently in England by two technical economists of a book studying the top 100 transnational corporations in the Fortune list. And a lot of interesting stuff. But one thing that they discovered was that of the top 100, every single one had benefited from the industrial policy of its home country. And they say at least 20 of the 100 would not have survived if it hadn't been for either state takeover or large-scale state subsidy at points when they were facing losses. Also, most of them depend very heavily on the domestic market. Well, that's one of them, for example, is Lockheed, Gingrich's favorite, which was saved from destruction by, I think, a $2 billion government-subsidized loan when it was facing disaster back in the early 70s. Well, okay, that tells you what free trade is. Big multinationals are invariably, if this is correct, dependent on the state, meaning the public, in their home society, to keep them going, because they're not going to face market risks. It's only the poor people who have to face the market. That's really existing market doctrine. It's been that way for a couple hundred years, I should say.
There's a cover story in The Nation entitled Euro Battle Attacking the Welfare State. It's written by Daniel Singer, and he says, what's at stake is the unmistakable attempt by international financial establishment and continental governments to use this whole operation as a cover for adapting the U.S. model of Reaganomics. Its outcome is important for all Americans, particularly those not resigned to their current predicament. He continues, there are striking signs of resistance in Europe. There have been mass demonstrations, as you know, and strikes in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Canada. On October 25th, 250,000 Canadians turned out in protest to what was going on in social policy there. That's an astonishing figure. I mean, it's 1% of the total population of Canada.
Yeah, there's a lot of response all over the place. The picture is more or less correct, but we have to remember that Reaganomics, I'd be careful about using phrases like Reaganomics because it's a fraud. Reagan was the most, Reagan didn't know what was going on, but the people around him were the most protectionist in post-war American history. They virtually doubled various import restrictions. They poured money into advanced technology. If it hadn't been for their massive market interference, there probably would be no automobile or steel or semiconductor or other industries in the United States today. That's Reaganomics. Reaganomics is poor children face responsibility, but rich people get massive public subsidies and also state protection. So there we're preaching free markets to the poor, but on the other hand, James Baker, when he was Secretary of Treasury, was boasting to the business world that they had raised protection higher than any preceding government. So when we talk about Reaganomics, remember what it is. Same with Thatcher. One of the biggest industries is aerospace, which is largely public subsidized. I mean, it takes what's happening right now on the front page is Boeing and McDonnell Douglas are merging. That's private enterprise. I mean, take a look at the history of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. I mean, just you couldn't imagine a clearer case of state-subsidized, socialized industry. But of course, only the costs and risks are socialized. If the profits are privatized, and now it's got a near monopolistic position in a huge market, civilian aircraft. Civilian aircraft itself is a bit of a joke. Civilian aircraft means basically modified military aircraft.
In France, there are actually fewer workers in unions in the United States, which is already very low. Yet the support for French strikes, general strikes, shut down cities and at one point the whole country in December of 95 was extraordinarily high. What accounts for that?
Well, there are a lot of differences, but I think one factor is the power of business propaganda in the United States, which has succeeded in breaking down the relations among people and their sense of support for one another to an unusual extent. It's not, these are tendencies, but this is the home of business propaganda. This is the country where the public relations industry was developed, where it was most sophisticated. It's the home of the international entertainment industry, which is mainly propaganda. It's huge funds are put into controlling the public mind, as they put it. It's also, it's more of a business. I mean, France is. This is, though there isn't a capitalist society, and such a society wouldn't survive. This is toward the capitalist end, tends to be more business run than others, meaning that there's a huge amount of expenditure on marketing, which is a form of manipulation and deceit. Most recent estimate I saw is that it's about something like 1/6 of the gross domestic product goes to just marketing. Large part of that advertising. Advertising is tax deductible, so you pay for the privilege of being manipulated and controlled. This is unusually developed here. It exists everywhere, but it's unusually developed here. When I say it exists everywhere, we should remember that that's true. So go to the social democracies, like, say, Sweden. Sweden has big multinationals. Its economy rests very heavily on them. Some of them, they depend, like most of the big exporters, on public subsidy. In Sweden in particular, military industry. Military industry has been provided a good bit of the technology which allowed Ericsson to dominate a good part of the mobile phone market, whatever you call those things. You find these things everywhere. Meanwhile, the Swedish welfare state is being cut back, still way beyond us, but cut back while profits increase for the multinationals, which are being publicly subsidized. That's Sweden. This is the United States. There are different societies and different understandings and so on, but the same processes are at work globally.
Have you been following the new domestic political formations? The Labor Party had its founding convention in Cleveland in June of '96. The Alliance had its founding convention in Texas in November of '96. The new party was already established, running candidates. Ralph Nader ran for president on the Green Party ticket.
Well, there are certainly new formations developing. They ought to get together. I mean, scattering energies which are and resources which are very slight is not a good idea. But allowing new options to enter the political system is in general a good idea. I think probably the right way to do it, in my view, is the way that the new party has developed, with fusion candidates and concentrating on winnable elections and so on. But a labor-based party is a very good idea as well. They ought to be the same party. They have the same interests. If something can be created which is, say, like the NDP in Canada or like the Workers' Party in Brazil, big umbrella organizations which foster and support grassroots activities, provide resources, bring people together, provide a kind of an umbrella within which often parallel activities can be carried out, take some part as much as possible in the political system. That's all going to be to the good, and it can be progress towards something else. It's not going to overcome the fact that we have one business party and they're going to run things, because that's rooted in the structure of the institutions. Until we democratize the basic institutions, you won't break out of that. There's a nice comment by John Dewey about 70 years ago, who pointed out that he said politics is the shadow cast over society by big business. That's basically correct. As long as you have highly concentrated, unaccountable private power, politics is just going to be a shadow. But you might as well make use of the shadow as much as possible, and in fact use it to try to undermine the substance too that's casting the shadow.
But didn't he warn against mere attenuation of the shadow will not change?
He said that mere attenuation is not going to change the substance, which is correct, but mere attenuation will create the basis for undermining the substance. So, for example, let's take Social Security again. If you can rebuild and reconstitute and strengthen a culture in which social bonds are considered significant, you've made a step towards undermining the substance. And that involves participation. There's good reason why the business world wants to separate people from one another. Once you have your own assets under your control instead of Social Security. And that same reason, turned on its head, is why people should be finding ways in which they can work together as much as possible, even if it's under the shadow of that as yet unattackable substance. It goes back to that slogan I quoted you the other day from the rural workers in Brazil. You want to expand the floor of the cage. It's a cage. You recognize that. But you want to defend that cage from even worse predators, and you want to expand it, and ultimately you want to dismantle it. But expanding the floor of the cage is a step towards dismantling it. It creates different attitudes, different understandings, different forms of participation, ways for people to reconsider the way life ought to be lived instead of just taking the picture presented to them from the outside, even providing the information which is essential for organizing your life individually or collectively in a sensible fashion. So all of these things are steps to the good. Yeah, they will only attenuate and not overcome, but they're the basis for overcoming.
What about devising and coming up with new tactics and new strategies? Urvashi Ved, a young woman, has written a book called Virtual Equality, and she warns of the trap of that. We do that which we know. So, and if we do that, we always get what we always did, and you will always get what you always got.
No, I just don't agree with that. You learn by trying. New ideas, new ways of thinking about. If you the next step, you can't start now with current understandings and say, okay, let's design a libertarian society. You have to create the understanding and gain the insight that allows you to move step by step toward that end. That's just like in any other aspect of life or science for that matter. The strategy is to do more and learn more and find out the answers and find out ways of associating with other people and create the institutions, and out of them come new problems, new methods, new strategies. I mean, if somebody can come up with a strategy, everybody will be delighted. It hasn't yet happened in the last couple thousand years. So if you look, say, at the Marxist literature, it doesn't offer any strategies. And if, say, Marx had been asked, what's the strategy for overthrowing capitalism, he would have laughed. In fact, even somebody who's like a pure, overwhelmingly a tactician like Lenin, he didn't have any strategies. His only strategy was follow me. Okay, that's a kind of a strategy, I suppose. But he and Trotsky and others just adapted strategies to particular situations, circumstances, looking for their own goal, taking state power. I don't think that should be our goal. But a general strategy for overcoming authoritarian institutions, how could there be an answer to that question? There isn't any. The answer is, in fact, I think those questions are mostly asked by people who don't want to become engaged. If you want to become engaged, do it. There are plenty of problems around that you can work on, whether it's what you started with, hungry children, or destruction of the environment, or the breakdown of security in the workforce, public subsidy to huge transnationals. I mean, we can go on and on, up to destroying the shadow that's casting the substance that's casting the shadow. We can all the way, but it's not going to happen by pushing a button. It's going to happen by dedicated, concentrated work, which will slowly build up the understanding, the relationships among people, the perceptions, the support systems, the alternative institutions, and so on. Then something can happen. But there's no strategy for that.
Urvashi Ved also castigates what she calls the purist left for waiting for the perfect vision, the one and only answer, the charismatic leader, and something which I hear when I travel around the country is the one great solution, the internet.
Well, I agree with that criticism. I mean, waiting for a charismatic leader is just demanding disaster. As far as the internet's concerned, it's like other technology. It should be taken seriously. It has lots of opportunities, has lots of dangers. Right now, it's in a crucial phase, I think. It's Bob McChesney's written well about this. He pointed out that the Telecommunications Act of last year's Telecommunications Act was the biggest giveaway of public assets in history as an act of privatization, meaning handing over public resources to private power. It has no counterpart, and there weren't even token payments for it, as there are in, say, privatization in Mexico. And he also makes the interesting and important point that this issue was not treated as a social and political issue. It was treated only as a business issue. So you read about it in the business pages. You didn't read about it in the front pages. It wasn't in the public arena. The issue, shall we give away these public resources to private power, that was not discussed. All that was discussed was how shall we give them away? Shall we give them away to 5 megacorporations or to 12 megacorporations? That was discussed. But not shall we give it away. That is a tremendous propaganda victory, because here there's this enormous resource built at public expense, now being handed over to private power, which has its obvious interests, namely the ones I mentioned before, to create a society based on social units consisting of you and maybe your internet connection. Sure, they have very good reasons for wanting that, but do we want that? Now, the internet can be used for all sorts of other things if it remains under public control. It's like, so the saying the internet is the answer, well, of course it's not the answer, but it's important. I mean, modes of communication and interaction are, of course, important. Print is important, radio is important, television is important. This mode of communication and interaction is important, and can be used for very efficiently and for very good purposes, and has been, in fact. But it can also be used very destructively. Technology is usually like that. I mean, you can't ask, is a hammer good or bad? You know, you put it in the hands of a torturer, it can be bad. You put it in the hands of somebody who's trying to build a house, it can be good. And the internet is the same. So yeah, it's worth paying a lot of attention to it and to see what's happening, and to try to prevent it from being turned into a hammer in the hands of a torturer. But obviously, it's not the solution for everything. On the other hand, the comment you quoted before, you don't sit around waiting for a charismatic leader, or for that matter, for a grand strategy. That's good advice. If that comes, it'll be a disaster, as it always has been. If something grows out of popular action and participation, it can be healthy. Maybe it won't be, but at least it can be. There's no other way.
I know traditionally have seen top-down strategies and movements always kind of inherently doomed.
Well, you know, they can very well succeed in being exactly what they're designed to do, namely maintain top-down leadership, control, authority, and so on. It shouldn't have come as a tremendous surprise to anyone that a vanguard party would end up being a totalitarian state. In fact, Trotsky had predicted that years before he decided to play the game himself.
I was talking to Howard Zinn about how social change happens, and he suggests that we really need to reconceptualize and rethink time in terms of social change, sort of comparing it maybe perhaps to a sprinter, which everyone wants to be, and versus the long-distance runner. What do you think of that?
Yeah, he's right. This is, I don't know if he was thinking of this, but it was very striking in the 1960s when the student movement began. It was sort of, in a way, coming out of nowhere. There wasn't an organized, well-established, popular base left that it could join. So the leadership was very quickly taken in the hands of very young people, often very nice young people, decent people, who were then going to do something. It was striking what they wanted to do. I don't know how much of this you were part of, but the goals were, the perception was extremely short range. I mean, I remember at the time of the Colombia strike, I had a lot of disagreements with the people who were running the Colombia strike, pretty acid ones, in fact, which went into, public meetings and so on. But their conception was, look, for many of them, not all, we'll strike at Colombia, close down the buildings for a couple of weeks. After that, we'll have a revolution, and then we'll all go out and have fun. A lot of the spirit of '68 was like that. That's not the way things work. It was a disaster for the people involved. It left a sad legacy. The long-term consequences were not good. And for exactly the reasons Howard mentions, that's not the way things work. You have to build slowly and ensure that the next step comes out of a basis that's already established in people's understanding and their perceptions and their attitudes towards one another, their conception of what they want to attain and the circumstances in which you can attain it. For example, it makes absolutely no sense to expose yourself and others to destruction when you don't have a social base in which you can protect the gains that you've made. That has been found over and over again in guerrilla movements, in popular movements, and elsewhere. You get cut off by the powerful.
You've been doing a lot of international travel, and I know you've been to Colombia, for example, where you've observed these kinds of grassroots popular movements. Can Americans learn anything? Are these analogous situations?
You're talking about
Colombia, South America.
Yeah, but well, actually, I wasn't in Colombia very long. I was there a couple months ago, but I was for a longer period in Brazil and Argentina just now, in fact.
Well, do you see any lessons that people in the U.S. can learn?
Oh, sure. I mean, one thing I was first of all, there's very vibrant and vital, dynamic societies with huge problems, but lots of things going on. One thing I have to say I was immediately struck by is that no one ever asked what's the grand strategy for overthrowing our, this and that. No, people they don't say, what should I do? They say, here's what I'm doing. What do you think about it? And not only say, but show. I think I described to you some of the things. There's lots of things going on, and they're impressive. The circumstances are extremely difficult, much harder than anything we face, but lots of people doing things, some of them that we could easily do. But they're not sitting waiting for a magic key, which there isn't. Brazil, for example, has the largest labor-based party in the world, which would have won any fair election. By that I don't mean that the votes were stolen. I mean that the resources and the media were so overwhelmingly on the other side that there wasn't a serious election. But otherwise they would have won. It's I'm sure it has its problems, but it's an impressive organization with a kind of a radical democratic and socialist thrust, a lot of popular support, lots of potential. The landless workers movement is struggling under very hard circumstances to deal with the core, at least a core problem of Brazilian society, the incredible inequality of land ownership and control, and in fact inequality generally. I think I mentioned to you some of the media projects that I saw, which were very interesting. There's organizing in shanty towns. I would just go on and on. There's a lot of exciting, important things. Whether is it enough to change? I think they're also trapped by many delusions, which they have to break out of. You have to free yourself intellectually too. You have to free your mind. And stop me if we've talked about this, but the weapon that is being used to carry out the analog to Reaganomics in Brazil is the debt. Same with most of Latin America. They got this terrible debt. We've got to minimize the state. They don't have any debt, and you have to understand that. Just as we have to understand that private tyrannies have no legitimacy. And that the issue about the internet isn't how to privatize it. I mean, there's lots of things we all have to understand, and you have to liberate yourself. People don't liberate themselves alone. You liberate yourselves through participation with others, just like you learn things in science by interacting with others. And the complicated network of popular organizations and the umbrella groups like the Workers' Party, they help create a basis for this. Is it enough to bring about serious changes? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, we have all sorts of advantages that they don't have, like, for example, enormous wealth. Also, we have the unique advantage that we don't have a superpower standing over us. We are the superpower. That makes a huge difference. So the opportunities here are vastly greater. On the other hand, it's kind of striking to see, you just feel how stultifying it is when you come from there back to here in many ways. For one thing, the doctrinal rigidity here is startling. Anybody who comes back from the third world to the West in general, but here in particular, is struck by the narrowing of thought and understanding, the limited nature of legitimate discussion, the separation of people from one another. Very striking facts. I don't think, I wasn't in Chile long enough to have much of an impression, but I think it's probably true there too, because that's a country which is very clearly under military rule. We call it a democracy, but yeah, it's a democracy with the military setting very narrow bounds as to what can happen, and it's in people's attitudes. You can see it. They know that there are limits you don't transcend.
Do you have any ideas on getting from the choir to those that agree with your ideas to the larger congregation? That seems to be a major problem.
I don't know what the problem is exactly. I mean, it's the usual problem. First of all, I think almost everybody agrees with the ideas. For example, 95% of the population thinks that corporations ought to sacrifice profits for the benefit of workers and communities. Well, I agree with that. I don't think that's enough, but I certainly agree with that. So I'm talking about 5% of the population. Over 80% of the population thinks the economic system is inherently unfair and ought to be changed. I agree with that. How do you get out? By doing it. Everywhere you go or I go or anyone else goes, it's because some organized group has set something up. Okay, I can't go to, say, Kansas City and say, okay, I'm going to give a talk. You know, we won't have one person showing up. Why should they? On the other hand, if some group there, which is organizing and active, says, okay, let's put together a meeting and bring people in, well, yeah, then you can go and give a talk. You can talk to people, and they come from all over the place. It always goes back to the same thing. If people are going to dedicate themselves to organizing and activism, whether it's in unions or in community organizations or working on health problems or on and on, yes, then you can have access to broader and broader audiences. How broad depends how strong the movement is.
Michael Moore is a filmmaker. He did Roger and Me. It's a documentary, and he also does TV Nation. He has a new book out called Downsize This. He says the problem with the left is that it's boring. It whines too much, and it's very negative, and that turns people off. Anything to that?
Well, maybe. If it is, it's making a mistake. I mean, for example, I don't think Howard Zinn whines too much and turns people off. Okay. Probably plenty of people do. If you go and read a Marxist tract to, take the example that I gave you the other day of that media group in Brazil, which after very careful planning and working with leadership in the communities, presented television skits in public which turned people off. Yeah, because they were boring and they were full of jargon and they were intellectual talk and so on. That's right. On the other hand, when they came back and let the people do it themselves and gave them technical assistance, well, it turned out not to be boring and not to turn people off. That's exactly right. One thing what people, like to write fancy articles about responsibility of intellectuals and so on. That's the responsibility. Go out and do things like that, and make sure it's the people themselves who are doing it, and you give them what help you can, and learn from them. And that's the responsibility of intellectuals. There's plenty of things like this to do all over the place.
The radio program that I do, this weekly 1-hour program, is pretty effectively locked out of this Boston to Miami corridor. This belt here is very, very difficult to penetrate. Whereas in contrast with that, in the West, in Montana, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in places like that, it's much easier to get this kind of program on the air.
Well, I think there are institutional reasons for that, but we shouldn't blame the institutions. Institutional reasons are pretty obvious. Same reason why discussion is narrower and more rigid and more stultifying here than in other countries. It's just more important. This is the part of the country where the decisions are being made. So you've got to keep it under tight doctrinal control and make sure that nothing gets out of hand. Doesn't matter, what people are talking about in Laramie, Wyoming. They're not going to do anything anyway. Still less in, the slums of Rio. So there are institutional reasons. On the other hand, don't just blame them. People here are not making use of the possibilities they have. So take, say, right here where we are, Cambridge. Well, Cambridge, like other towns, has a cable television, community cable television station. That was part of the Cable Communications Act, that the companies had to provide facilities. I've been there a couple times. I mean, I'm not a big techie, but even I could see they have pretty good equipment. They claim to have outreach to the Cambridge area. Is it used by anybody? It's available to the public. I mean, the one time I was there, it was on a program that was so crazy I almost walked off. Is it being used? No, it's not being used. I mean, in the slums of Rio, do they have cable television stations which the people can use? Boy, they'd be delighted if they had them. We have them, we don't use them. Going back to Michael Moore, it's okay to whine about the fact that they're closing us out. How about doing something about it? Even using the facilities that are there. And what would happen if you had lively local cable TV? You'd find that the commercial channels would be responding to that. They'd have to. They might try to stop it or to undercut it or co-opt it or something, but they would have to respond to it if it got to be a big enough scale. Same with the other media. Same with NPR. They're not going to be able to disregard what's happening in their communities. If nothing's happening, sure, they have a free ride. So on the one hand, there are understandable institutional reasons why this corridor should be the most deeply indoctrinated, the most rigid, the hardest to penetrate, but it's not a law of nature. And in fact, the same reasons that make it the most rigid make it the richest in resources, meaning the richest in options to overcome this, if people do something about it, not if they sit around waiting for a savior.
Fortunately, tapes is such a medium that they're easy to duplicate and to pass around, and that's one mechanism to disseminate this information. And we have the example of the Iranian Revolution. It was called the first cassette revolution.
Yeah, there's lots of opportunities, and we can't talk about lack of them. We're so, compared with others who do things, our resources and options are so enormous that we can only blame ourselves, however difficult the problem.
Let's talk a little bit further about the media and this notion of supply and demand in the current tabloidization of the news. What I hear, when criticisms are made of what's happening to newscasts and the content of the news, the program directors, the editors are saying, we're giving the public what they want. No one's forcing them to read this stuff. No one's forcing them to turn on the TV and watch the crime reports and the sports reports, etc. What do you think about that?
Well, there actually are studies of what people want. What they want overwhelmingly is commercial-free television. Do you see commercial-free television? I mean, the television system is a bit here. It's a business. It's a business where big corporations sell audiences to other businesses, and they're going to keep it within narrow framework. What people want is socially created. For example, in this, take again that working class slum in Brazil that I mentioned. I was there in prime television time. They had all the soap operas and all the junk they run, but what at least the people who were there wanted was to see things that they themselves were producing about racism and debt and internal problems and so on. What you want depends on who you are. Who you are depends on what options you've had and what kind of training you've had and what experiences you've had. That determines what you want. So yes, certain wants are either created or limited or crafted, and other opportunities are cut off. The kinds of wants that come out of interaction with other people to solve a problem, those wants aren't going to be there unless there is interaction with other people to solve a problem. You can't just talk about, well, that's what people want. Sure, under that structured arrangement, that's what people will choose. Change the structure, they'll choose different things.
In August of 96, Gary Webb, who writes for the San Jose Mercury News, which is part of the Knight Ridder chain, which includes the Miami Herald, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Boulder Daily Camera. I mention that because, this is not Counterpunch or In These Times or Z Magazine. A mainstream corporate chain publishes a three-part article entitled Dark Alliance, purporting to show that there is some urgent connection between the explosion of crack cocaine in the Black Ghetto in L.A. and the Central Intelligence Agency. I noticed in the past you've always stayed away from such stories, and when inevitably you're asked about them in after lectures during the questions and answers, you don't give it a lot of energy.
That's not quite true. I mean, I just put it differently. For example, the relation between the CIA and drugs is certain. It's been well studied. I mean, since Al McCoy's work 25 years ago, there's been no secret about that. The trail of clandestine activities is followed very closely by drug activities. There are pretty good reasons for that. Clandestine activities require untraceable money. They require lots of thugs. Where are you going to go? Okay, it's natural. So it starts right after the Second World War, and we can follow a trail through the Golden Triangle from the French Connection and Marseille, trying to undermine the resistance in the unions, to the Golden Triangle and Laos, Burma, etc., on to Afghanistan, to all over the place. The CIA, of course, has been involved, but as an agency of state policy. What I don't agree with, here I differ from a lot of others, is I don't think the CIA is an independent agency. I think it does what it's told. You can maybe find examples, but as far as I read the record, the CIA is basically the agency of the White House, carrying out operations that require plausible deniability. Take the source of the Webb story, which is fundamentally correct. Bob Parry and Brian Barger exposed a lot of it 10 years ago. They were shut up very quickly, but their evidence was correct. The United States was involved in massive international terrorism throughout Central America. Much of it was clandestine to a large extent, meaning everybody knew about it, but it was enough below the surface so you could pretend you didn't. They needed the usual things, untraceable money, brutal thugs. They naturally turned right away to the narco-traffickers. Noriega was our great friend, remember, until he decided not to play a part in this any longer, became too independent, then had to be thrown out. But in the beginning, he was fine. Ordinary thug, narco-trafficker, helping with the Contras and so on and so forth. That was just fine. So, of course, there's a connection between the CIA and drugs. Now, what Webb did was trace some of the details and find that one aspect of that connection was that cocaine got into the ghetto through such and such a passage. Yeah, well, that's going to be predictable. When the CIA says they didn't know anything about it, I assume they're right. Why should they know anything about it? It's not their business. The structure of the system, however, is very clear. And it's not just this case, it's many other cases. That it's going to end up in the ghettos is not a plot, it's just going to happen in the natural course of events. It's not going to sneak into well-defended communities, which can protect themselves. It'll break into communities that are being devastated, often by external social forces, where people are alone, have to fight for survival, where kids aren't cared for because their parents are working to put food on the table. Yeah, that's where it's going to break into, not in Lexington, where I live.
Have you had an opportunity at all to acquaint yourself with Buddhist? Have you had an opportunity at all to acquaint yourself with Buddhist thought or philosophy?
I've read some of the texts and some of the literature, but I wouldn't say I'm acquainted with it.
I'll tell you why I ask, because David Edwards, a British writer in a South End book called Burning All Illusions, really compares what you're doing with providing people with tools of intellectual self-defense as very close to Buddhist teachings.
Could be. Just sounds to me like common sense, but if it's if Buddha said it 2,500 years ago, that's fine.
You wrote to David Peterson at one point, our mutual friend in Chicago, about what the when the educated classes line up for a parade, a person of conscience has 3 options. Do you remember? Do you remember that?
Nope.
Well,
sounds interesting, though. What are the three options?
Well, either one can join them and march in the parade, or one can join the cheering throngs and watch from the sidelines, or one can speak out against it all and, of course, expect to pay the price.
Yeah, that's about right. It's been going on for a couple thousand years, too.
So where do you see yourself in that parade structure?
Well, that's a question of choice, but I would like to see myself with those who are not joining and not cheering. Incidentally, since you mentioned Buddha, there's, the origins of our own history are exactly that. Go back to the oldest recorded texts and just notice what happened to the people who didn't march in the parades. So, like what happened to Socrates. Wasn't treated very nicely. Or take say the Bible. The Bible had intellectuals. We didn't call them intellectuals; they called them prophets, and they fell into the usual two classes. There were the ones who were flattering the kings and telling them how wonderful they are, and leading the parade or cheering the parade. They were the ones who were honored and respected. A couple of 100 years later, 1,000 years later, they were called the false prophets, but not at the time. There were other people, like, say, Amos, who incidentally insisted, I am not an intellectual, or as he put it, I'm not a prophet, and I'm not the son of a prophet, I'm a poor farmer. He had other things to say, as did many of the people who were later, much later, honored as prophets. They weren't treated very nicely, if you look back. They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, persecuted, hated, despised. Yeah. Any surprise in that? No, exactly right. If you don't join in the parade and you remember the prophets were giving geopolitical analysis as well as moral lessons, all hated. Geopolitical analysis turned out to be pretty accurate. The moral prescriptions you can judge, but often very elevated. Why are the people in power going to like that? Of course they're going to drive them out. You might say, going back to your television producer about people watching what they want, well, yeah, it was the public who was driving them into the desert and imprisoning them. They didn't want to hear it either. That's true, not because they're bad people, but for the usual reasons: short-term interest, manipulation, dependence on power, all the usual reasons. And that's an image of what the world is like. Of course, that's a negative image, and there are plenty of successes. The world is way better than it was not very long ago. You go back to the 18th century, the way people were treating each other looks like an unbelievable horror. Go back 50 years, and it's indescribably bad, the circumstances. I mean, right now, for example, we're trying to defend a minimal health care system. 30 years ago, we weren't, because there wasn't any. That's progress. And over a long period, there are plenty of successes, and they're cumulative, and they create, they lead us to new peaks to climb. Plenty of failures, too. Nobody ever ensured that it was going to be easy.
A couple of people who've really labored against enormous odds, Jose Ramos Horta and Bishop Carlo of East Timor, honored with the Nobel Prize. Your observation?
That was great. Yeah, I ran into Jose Ramos Horta in Sao Paulo. He's an old personal friend for 20 years. It was a wonderful thing. Ramos Horta said, I think, I haven't seen his official speech yet, but certainly was saying in public that the prize should have been given to Shanana, who's the leader of the resistance to the Indonesian aggression. He's in an Indonesian jail. But the recognition of this struggle is a very important thing, or it will be an important thing if we can turn it into something. It'll be suppressed as quickly as possible, so polite applause, and then, let's forget about it. And if that happens, it's our fault, nobody else's. This gives an opportunity to keep this issue up front. In many ways of doing it. Right now, the Clinton administration, for example, is planning to send advanced arms to Indonesia. That doesn't have to work. But it will work unless there's a real public outcry. The granting of the Nobel Peace Prize offers an opportunity, in fact, kind of golden opportunity for people who care about the fate of a couple 100,000 people to do something about it, but it's not going to happen by itself. Yeah. In fact, some of the major issues about this have never even made it to the American press, like the oil issue. There's nothing about that. I mean, a large part of the reason for the Indonesian invasion and the U.S. and Australian support for it was that Timor has rich oil resources, which are now being robbed in an outlandishly disgraceful Australian-Indonesian treaty with American U.S. oil companies involved. That's part of the core of this entire issue. That is yet to be discussed, except really out at the fringes. Well, we can do something about that.
I think it was in the early 1980s, didn't you have occasion to go to the New York Times editorial offices in New York with a Portuguese Timorese?
What actually happened was that several things. For one thing, paid, since they were refusing to interview Timorese refugees in Lisbon and Australia, claiming they had no access to them.
The Times was claiming that.
Everybody was, We brought over some Timorese refugees. Actually, I paid for them from Lisbon and tried to bring them to editorial offices. That didn't work. The case you're mentioning was a little more complicated. I don't even know how much it's worth telling. This story has not been told because we don't want to. I'm not sure how much to tell of it, but the basic, someday it'll be told. The basic fact is that what you said is more or less accurate. I managed to arrange in an interesting way to have a Portuguese priest, Father Leoneto de Rego, interviewed by the New York Times. Background for that is interesting, but I finally managed to have it happen. He was a very interesting man, a very credible witness. He'd been living in the mountains with the Timorese resistance. He'd been driven out during the really near genocidal campaign of 1978 when Carter vastly increased the flow of weapons and Indonesia really smashed people. That's when they talk about hundreds of thousands of people being killed, that's then, 78. A lot of people were driven out of the hills. He was one of them. He's Portuguese, so they didn't murder him. They let him get out. He was a very credible witness. He was a classmate of the Archbishop up here. Pretty hard to disregard. He could describe what was happening. Nobody would talk to him. I finally, in a complicated way, got the New York Times to agree to interview him. The interview ran. It was by Kathleen Telch. It was utter disgrace. Said almost nothing about what was happening. Had one line in it saying, he says things aren't nice in Timor or something like that. I think it must be that event that shamed the Times editors into running their first serious editorial on the problem. That's my strong suspicion. The transcript of that interview later leaked. I was working very hard to try to get the Globe here, the Boston Globe, to cover the story. They were just publishing State Department handouts and Indonesian general apologetics. Never. I finally got them to agree to look at the facts. They offered to let me write an op-ed. I said, no, I don't want to write an op-ed. Get one of your reporters to look into it. So they didn't take it too seriously, and they gave it to an extremely good reporter who is not an international reporter. He's a local reporter. I think, latest I heard, he's reporting on restaurants. Very smart guy and a very good reporter. He dug the way you dig into a local story, a corrupt judge. Good reporter. Well, one of the things, we helped him with some leads, but he picked it up and ran with the story. He wrote the best story on this thing that had ever appeared in the American press. One of the things he did was get to the State Department and find a guy who had been transferred away from the Indonesia desk because he didn't like what was going on. And somehow this guy leaked to him a transcript of the actual New York Times interview, which he had. And he published good parts of it, and it was a very powerful interview with Father Leoneto saying some extremely important things. So it appeared in that fashion. The Times interview did appear in the Boston Globe. But that was, I think, must have been around 1981 or so, when all this stuff, 80, 81, around then, all this stuff was going on. The net effect was that finally, the censorship had been total, and I mean total. In 1978, when the atrocities peaked and U.S. arms flow peaked and British arms peaked. Coverage was literally zero. Actually, the first article in the United States, at least it's listed in Reader's Guide, that specifically deals with Timor is my own, an inquiry, right-wing libertarian journal where I was writing in those days. And it was basically testimony that I'd given in the United Nations on the suppression of the issue by the Western press, primarily the U.S. press. There had been an earlier article by Arnold Cohen about Indonesia in The Nation, which had discussed this in the context, and that's it for the journals, the press. It's not that nobody noticed it. You go back to 1974-75, there was very extensive coverage in the context of the collapse of the Portuguese Empire. Then it dropped, hit zero at the peak of the atrocities, started picking up again around 79, 80 as a result very largely of these activities. Incidentally, here's a case where a very small number of people, the most important by far being Arnold Cohen, managed to get the thing into, to some extent into the public arena. Certainly saved tens of thousands of lives. The Red Cross was allowed in. There was some attention. The terror continued, but lessened. And on to the present. Here's a case, incidentally, where the Internet made a difference. It was a very small and scattered support group until the Internet came along. And that was used very constructively by Charlie Shiner and other people to really set up a wide base of support to bring information to people who couldn't get it. I mean, I was getting information from Australian press, but how many people have friends in Australia who send them the press? Now everybody was getting it, who wanted it, very fast. The movement grew, became significant enough to have an impact, so things developed.
Did you follow the Jennifer Harberry case in Guatemala? And
yeah, I wrote the introduction to her book, as you may recall.
Bridge of Courage.
Yeah.
Well, that was a kind of one person without a lot of resources.
Absolutely, very courageous woman, still fighting. She's one of several. Sister Diana Ortiz is another who's been so intimidated that she's finally backed off from it, I understand. That takes a lot of guts.
Was this peace treaty that was signed signal the end to this three-decade-old bloodbath?
I think the peace treaty is, I'm sort of glad it's being signed, but it's a sad occasion. What it reflects is the great success of state terror, which has devastated any serious opposition, has intimidated people, has made it not only acceptable to them, but even desirable for them to have the rule of ultra-right business interests, mostly foreign interests, in a peace treaty which may, let's hope, put an end to the real horrors. So in the context, step forward, but in the broader picture, a very ugly outcome of one of the biggest state terror operations of the modern period, which started in 1954 when the U.S. took part in overthrowing the one democratic government.
I'd like to just maybe close with an incident that you told me about, just to give people a flavor of how far you've traveled personally in your family background. We were sitting in a car in North Carolina 6 or 7 years ago. I'm sure you recall it vividly.
Vividly,
yeah. And you told me about this incident involving yourself and your brother David and your Orthodox grandfather over a radio. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, I remember it very well. Well, I don't know, should I tell you?
Yeah.
This, my family was first generation, so we lived in Philadelphia, but there were two big branches of the family. My father's family was in Baltimore, my mother's family was in New York, and they were quite different. The one in Baltimore was pretty religious, very religious. In fact, my father told me that they reverted into even deeper orthodoxy after they left Eastern Europe and came here, which is not unknown. And we were sort of observant, but not super orthodox. And my brother and I was maybe 6 or 7, I guess, and he was maybe 2 or something like that. We went there for the holidays. It was nice. Saw your cousins, loved your aunt, all that sort of business. But there was always a tone of fear, which I remember very well from childhood. The fear was, I'm going to do something wrong. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to do something wrong because I don't know the rules. It wasn't that they were harsh or anything. You just knew you were going to do something wrong and you were going to be ashamed of it, and it was inevitable. It's one of these things that's inevitable. You just know what it was, but it was going to happen. And the incident I remember is when my brother, who was maybe 2 or 3, on Saturday, turned on a radio very loud. And Saturday's the day, it's the big family day, everybody's sitting around the kitchen, and, having fun, and so on and so forth. And this radio starts blaring, driving everybody crazy. And of course, nobody could turn it down. You're not allowed to touch it on Saturday. So he understood enough to know that he had done something really criminal. He had made everybody suffer with this horrible noise all through Saturday. I was a couple years older, and I could perceive the criminality even greater. But I'm sure it didn't leave an indelible stain on his memory. If he's listening to this, he's probably forgotten about it. But I remember it quite well. I guess that must be the incident. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Noam.